It was a really nice place to live. People knew the neighbours, helped the neighbours, talked to the neighbours. It just was like I suppose it's overstating it, but like a big family in a way. It was a good place to be.
If you speak to the majority of kids in Maside and ask them for their opinion about Maside, I think most of them will say that they like Maside because Maside is it's a happy place. It's a place that they enjoy being in.
Skipping and jumping, singing and leaping, playing in the hot white sun. We don't care about rowing and fighting. We know how to laugh and run.
Back in the 1960s, there was a very clear sense of the incoming community. But the numbers weren't as big back then as they were to become. And I think it was only later that people began to appreciate the vibrancy that was brought by the African descent communities coming in.
When I was young, there weren't that many black families in Moss Side, though I don't particularly remember it. My mother did tell me that there was a lot of animosity towards her and my father because they were a mixed race couple and they weren't particularly popular.
Years ago there was a degree of racism, and we'd gone through that. It'd gone. It wasn't there anymore. We were all friends. We'd stop in the street and talk to people. Black, white, brown, it didn't make any difference. I had friends of just about every race. We'd got good social lives. Our pubs were fine. And we just lost all that. Just boom, gone.
Going to a pub on a Friday night was really great. People playing the piano, sing song and all of that. Yeah, so that all was nice. And I think that it was that sense of community that people are actually nostalgic for. And proximity. I mean, the feeling that you lived in proximity to other people.
The Caribbean community starts coming famously with the Windrush in 1948, but already there was the beginnings of a Sikh community in Moss Side. There already were people who lived in Moss Side because it was a relatively easy place to get to Trafford Park, where there was a lot of industrial jobs, and to the docks, where there was similarly quite a lot of work.
I mean, I think the main thing is that Moss Side, like Notting Hill, was a very run-down area. Basically, what had happened was the working class population had already, many of the people who lived there had already moved out. If they did well, they'd moved out to the outer suburbs, to Wythenshawe, to Didsbury, wherever. Inner cities were emptying out. There was no capital investment going on, so the houses were falling apart, and it was really hadn't been touched, hadn't been looked after.
Moss Side had initially been built as a middle class, or largely middle class suburb, back in the Victorian times, and then as the city expanded, the middle class moved out, and Moss Side became one of the working class communities of Manchester. As Manchester developed, so the original housing very often just simply fell down. In the 1950s, there was a house falling down somewhere in this area almost every day.
There's no beauty at all in Moss Side. If there's any beauty, it's only between friends. There is no physical beauty at all. One of the problems in an area like this is that white inhabitants blame black people for the chaos and decay that surrounds them, failing to realize that they lived with that decay long before black people dreamt of coming to Britain. the fact that racism thrives on stereotypes make this even more necessary. So people are much more likely to identify black people as a visible enemy, to be hated because they're black, rather than identifying the people who produce slum conditions and perpetuate ghettos.
The local council got into a massive slum clearance and redevelopment scheme in the late 50s, absolutely massive. And one of the places where it was focused, and perhaps its first big focus, was in Hume. That was cleared in such a massive way that the whole community was dispersed and ended up on new council housing scattered across Greater Manchester in places like Partington beyond Sale, near the Mersey estuary, in Hattersley, up nearly into the Peak District and so forth. And so the community was destroyed by that process.
We had seen what had happened in Hume. I mean, we were quite appalled and scared by what they'd done in Hume. They'd destroyed a rough and ready community, yeah, but they'd absolutely destroyed them and stuck them in awful grey monstrosities that went up into the sky.
Hume was the first place to come down in the 60s, early 60s, and by the late 60s, when it was Moss Side's turn, it was clear that people were not going to accept what was happening, which was that people were being sent to overspill estates, which could be 5 or 10 or even more miles away. They accepted the need to rebuild most of the property, but they insisted that they shouldn't be broken up.
And I know some of the housing was a in very poor state, so like it probably did need demolishing and rebuilding, but some of it wasn't. Some of it just needed refurbishment. Like it just need. I think a lot of people were moved out from Moss Side, either to Wythenshawe or up to up East Manchester, like Hydeway. And like you say, that meant that a lot of families were uprooted. They were taken away from what they had known.
They had a kitchen sink and an outside loo, and that was your plumbing, that was it. And then you had a tin bath in front of the fire, so it was really kind of fairly primitive living. And no central heating, so you just had to heat the house with coal fires.
And there's a horrible scenario to this, but it's also about urban planning in general, and this doesn't date, it carries on, is that it can be quite brutal when certainly wherever you've grown up and wherever you've lived and whatever you've done is suddenly taken away from you, because literally tenants of the Moss Side area were interviewed, and one of the things that they were told is that they had to leave because of the widening of the parkway, and there was certainly going to be what you call redevelopment. Urbanism was taking place, town planning was in full blown from Manchester Corporation. And they were given literally peanuts for the properties that were probably theirs, that they owned. To say to somebody, your house is worth, I don't know, about £800, and giving them 30 quid bricks and mortar price for it just to clear off is scandalous.
A lot of the existing properties were compulsorily purchased so that they could demolish them. But I think like you said before, the pictures. If you see pictures of Moss Side during the development, it was just obliterated. Well, sorry, that Princess Road area and Alexandra Road, just obliterated.
But there's an awful lot of stories came around the community that the African Caribbean communities, members of the communities that had bought their houses, had to sell them to the local authority for £1. And this was a major brick or a major reason for people in the African Caribbean communities losing trust in the local authority.
It might look shocking to us today, but it didn't feel shocking. It was just dilapidated. Most of the housing in Moss Side was 2-storey terraces. Yes, bricks were crumbling and roofs were leaking, and there were mice infections everywhere. etc. But arguably, the housing could have been restored rather than demolished. So it's interesting, the heart of Moss Side, the terrace housing is still there today. But it was the stuff that was built in the late Victorian times. So the earlier part of Moss Side that had been built earlier all came down, which was the West Moss Side.
Probably there would be some places that really ought to be demolished, but you can do that on a very small scale and then rebuild in that area something that fits in with the history of the place. But there were some very good landlords who did look after their properties, and the problem in some of them was that they hadn't been looked after for many, many years, and it would have been too expensive to renovate them in some cases, but they could have been pulled down on a small scale and rebuilt within the area.
There was six children and my mother and father living in a 3-bedroom terrace.
But there were houses that were massively overcrowded. Something did need to be done. No, there's no doubt about that. I think the main thing is not disrupting the social relationships, but respecting them.
Particularly for young people, young black men, to be sent to an estate on the edge of the city where you might be the only black kid in the school would almost certainly create all kinds of issues. And many of these young black men come back into Moss Side simply because this is an area where they're not getting the kind of hassle that they're getting when they're living out on one of the overspill estates.
I don't remember much about moving apart from we had to move, and I think when you had your letter of notice to move, I think you were given 2 opportunities. One that they'd offer you 2 opportunities. The first one you could refuse if you didn't like where it was or the condition of the property, and then you had to take your second one. Plus the fact it's not about buildings and roads and in terms of where you live. It's about the people. The people of the community, and when you disperse a whole community like that, you atomise everybody, and then you expect them all to come back collectively.
We wanted to stay together. We wanted to stay in the community that we were in. And I mean, it might have been difficult, but they could have done a hell of a lot more than they did. They just scattered people anywhere. If you had 4 people in a family, they'd just look if there was enough bedrooms in their house. It didn't matter to the council whether it was a suitable place, whether you were likely to know anybody there. We weren't people to them, we were just items.
Manchester Town Hall was very resistant to building high. They didn't want tower blocks, they didn't want to go up high, so there were kind of lots of compromises in terms of the number of new houses they needed. They wanted to move quickly, and they never quite had the capacity, the space capacity to do that. So I think there were lots of compromises.
The point is that other authorities had put people into tower blocks, which meant they could stay in the area, but they lost all of the qualities that the council insisted on people being able to live in proper houses. The downside of that was the need, the council believed, to have everybody in overspill estates, or large proportion of people moved to overspill estates, and that's where the conflict came.
We invited a guy called George Clark to speak at an open meeting in the Student Union in January of '68. And George Clark had become the leader of an organisation called Notting Hill Community Workshop, which was working in an area of London, multi-ethnic area, that had many similarities in those days to Moss Side in Manchester. A second meeting was called by Nick Zenow, a student who had been a volunteer at Notting Hill Community Workshop the year before.
I'd been involved in a thing in Notting Hill, which was based on the principle of community action. I'd been involved in it for 2 or 3 years, where the idea was to empower the community.
The first significant thing that came out of those meetings was it led the clergy and social workers to establish an organisation in Moss Side in response to the needs of the area, called Moss Side People's Association.
The demand for consultation is absolutely at the centre of it. There's a recognition that quite a lot of the housing will need to be demolished. They do want, however, to be able to have some of the housing renovated rather than demolished. There's a serious opposition, in fact, to the idea of wholesale demolition.
What was happening, and we were attending meetings of the People's Association and their working groups, but nothing was happening. It was very frustrating. It was as though this huge challenge from the juggernaut was facing Moss Siders. A People's Association had been established by the local clergy and social workers, but the issue of housing and the way the bulldozers were about to come in the area which people were worried about and concerned about, especially knowing that they might be dispersed and broken up as a community. And given that it was a multi-ethnic community, unlike Hume, but was largely all white, the last thing they wanted was to all be broken up. So there was a fear and anxiety, and the People's Association had failed to respond to and capture and think of ways with other local people of responding to that issue.
The Housing Action Group really is set up out of a battle with a very respectable number of people who have set up actually the Moss Side People's Association, which is a very top-down organised structure. And there's a feeling that the Moss Side People's Association doesn't fully represent people in Moss Side. And it's that moment in January 1969 where the 500 people come together to set up the Housing Action Group, which brings to the fore people like Rick Sumner, who's a scaffolder, Berry Edwards, who's actually a victimised printer but comes from Guyana.
And I think the question for us was, how would that redevelopment take place? It wasn't so much whether it should be redeveloped, but how was it going to be redeveloped? Basically, it was an opportunity for the community to be empowered to say what kind of community they wanted to live in, and to, to actually create a community. So that, as opposed to being, because the history of redevelopments had been, it was seen as slum clearance, and you basically put up a development which is very idealistic somewhere else, Cheetham or wherever out of Manchester. That's how they'd done it in the past. And then they cleared, because they'd already cleared Hume, and they, without any consultation, just knocked all the houses in Hume down and shipped everybody out to these moorlands, and people hated it. I mean, that was the thing. So it was actually a very Stalinist model. It was exactly what Ceausescu would have done or Stalin would have done, and the Manchester Council operated in exactly the same fashion. We've been elected. We're the leaders of the people. We decide what they should do. We know what's best for them, and there we go.
We needed to call a meeting that raised the issue of the bulldozers were approaching the area, that we knew it was in the plans of the council that within 2 years, maybe less, the clearance of Moss Side would begin. And it was there, planned, even if the details weren't all there. So we called a meeting. We met, as I said, with a number of the leading activists in the area, put to them our idea there needed to be a bigger campaign focused on slum clearance and what was happening about it. And residents should not only know what's happening, but be involved in how it happened.
And basically we were determined, after talking with this guy Wilf, who was the architect working in the council. I mean, he knew a lot of architects didn't believe in this, knew that this wasn't a good method because they could see what the disaster the redevelopment of Hume had been and the consequences of that, and they didn't want to do it the same way. So our idea was to set up a sort of popular movement in Moss Side, basically to start having a say in what should happen. Wilf's idea, I think, was that what he and the architects in the council wanted to do, or the younger architects in the council wanted to do, they wanted to have, what is now common practice, which is, having a dialogue with the community about what kind of community it should be, which is now regarded as completely normal, but at that time was thought of as unbearably radical. How the hell can you do that? We're the experts. We work for the councillors. They were, for instance, prohibited from having any contact with the people in Moss Side in thinking about the redevelopment, as opposed to being told that they had to.
And what came out of that meeting specifically, and it was decided by the meeting, was starting a petition to raise the two issues that came out of the meeting that concerned people. One was that the council should come and talk to us in the area and engage us, residents of the area, in the clearance campaign, its timing, where we got moved to and so forth. And secondly, that the clearance should be done in such a way that people could stay locally if they wanted to.
The Moss Side News was a really important thing. We decided that we had to have a newspaper. A lot of this was secrecy. Everything was actually secret. You didn't really know what the council was planning until they suddenly sprung a surprise in the council room and bang, it had all been decided. It wasn't really debated in the council chamber, I don't think.
On the back of the first meeting, we sent a copy of this newspaper along with our letter, and that led to a letter back from the chief planner refusing any more meetings because of what had been said in our stroppy newsletter.
Well, we're telling the truth. We're telling the truth. They were not really interested in people as people. We weren't individuals. We didn't matter. We were just units, if you like. They weren't talks, really. They came along and told us what was going to happen and listened to what we said and then went away and ignored us completely.
There was then an item in the Daily Mail, the northern edition of the Daily Mail, and I think it was a headline on the front of the paper, that talked about these would-be revolutionaries in Moss Side and how the council would not listen or talk to them. The actual article itself wasn't too bad, but the headlines were absolutely outrageous. There was nothing off the wall about the demands of a housing action group.
At the end of the day, we lost totally and completely. It was a shame. A lot of the people that I was very, very friendly with, I've lost completely now. I've no idea where they are.
When they redeveloped, they built these properties that I don't think anybody was happy with. They were, I'd say they were ugly, featureless. Most of them, the ones that faced the road had tiny little windows that people really didn't like. I said nobody that I know was happy with the proposed developments.
A big problem, a big reason why they kind of failed was down to the local authorities running out of money. They could build them, but they didn't have the resources to maintain them. When these blocks were finished, equally local government kind of ran out of steam. The kind of 60s boom had turned into the kind of 70s malaise, and northern cities really struggled. You have to be sympathetic to people in the town hall or whatever. They're under pressure from politicians and the press to get on with things. They'd seen throughout the 1920s and the 1930s, thousands of people living in very poor housing conditions. They'd suffered through the Second World War, and they just really wanted to get on with it.
But the one thing that is never talked about is that the City Council offered you a brand new house on a council estate, and there's the keys and off you go, job done. They never put anything in place to help with what you call the mental adjustment. And just speaking from my own point of view, so I've just turned 8 years of age, and for 2 years, in terms of school, I was completely, and I didn't realise, and you could say, well, it's moving from one school to the next, and it happens with all kids, but I'm sure that my adjustment set back my education 2 years. You know, in school, for all you new kids who have just arrived here in this council estate, and you're coming to this school now, then basically they never thought about it, about the psychological readjustment for children. It's certainly at the adults. You know, I think in my family in particular, they felt lost. And there was no support from the council, who probably leafleted or had what you call community centres, to sort of talk through these things, because nobody talks about them. You just had to get on with it. Certainly in my own education, it did go back to, it went backwards 2 years, just because of that psychological readjustment of losing all your mates, losing all the familiarity. There's always the curriculum. The curriculum is there, but you need something else to, bring on the curriculum.
I don't know this for sure, but like I think the council's policy was really just to fill the place with I don't know, problem families. And I say problem in inverted commas. They weren't dangerous families. They were just people who they couldn't house elsewhere. It changed the atmosphere. I think it changed the attitude of others to Moss Side. More than the attitude of the people within Moss Side.
Infestations of just about every evil thing you could think of. The lifts used to break down frequently, so you'd got elderly people having to walk up 7 or 8 staircases. They were very cold places. I don't mean physically cold, but cold.
Those frustrations built, and like I say, I do think that a lot of people felt that they were being ghettoised, that they were being forced into living in Moss Side for various reasons, and that once they were there, that nobody really cared anymore. They were forgotten. People didn't. I don't think people felt that they had a voice. That nobody was listening to them. It definitely led to or contributed to the riots in 81, without a doubt.
Nowadays, and it didn't take that long after the 60s, that consultation became normal. Consultation about everything that councils or government did became a normal and valued part of the work that a council would do. So if they were redeveloping something, they would consult with people.
But if you then look at the Housing Action Group with its great demand for people having more control over their own lives and people being engaged in the redevelopment process, then those policies were more or less adopted by the Labour Party as a result of our campaign.
No, but it is literally the one thing that I feel proud about when I think about it. And I remember those days. It was just unbelievable, the autocratic, the arrogance, the utter arrogance with which these people acted. They were even proud of saying it. They'd say, no, I'm not here to listen to you, I'm here to tell you what's going to happen. And that was what we challenged. Which I think is a good thing.
A great number of people became, I'm going to say political with a small p, as a result of the things that happened, the fights they put up, the fights they lost, the people they united with. We grew up quite a lot. But people did look out for each other, they cared about each other, and that was quite special. Our worst fears came true. Still, it's gone. But I think about Moss Side quite often, in good terms, had some good times there.